why not attribute all aspects of the creation to the creator? In which case, we are not going to get the kind of God that the Abrahamic traditions are presuming here, right? That is being discussed. Good. Love seeing all these questions. Okay, so on this notion of goodness and evil, can one believe in God without believing in hell or the devil? Absolutely. And actually, this is, I'm going to put it in the chat as a note to myself. There's a reading I will add to the media, which is a female philosopher of religion who was a nun, and she argued against the existence of hell. Right? So she is a nun. So she's part of what tradition? Anyone know? An Abrahamic tradition. Good. Although I guess there could be Buddhist nuns as well. They technically call them nuns, monks and nuns. But yes, in this case, we're talking about a Catholic nun. Right? And so she argued against the existence of hell based on biblical understanding of God, right? So based on her, the most confined conservative understanding of theology, right? She's saying this still doesn't make sense, right? That the kind of God that is being discussed would allow for hell. And she goes through all different sorts of definitions of what we could mean by hell, all sorts of definitions of what we could mean by forgiveness, right? And all of these types of things, and how even the notion of forgiveness fits with a God, because a lot of conceptions of God involve them being immutable or unchangeable, right? So how could God forgive someone if they're not able to change, right? Forgiveness involves a change of a state of judgment, right? And so again, she's going through all of these different things. And so that is not J.L. Mackie, but it's called The Problem of Hell. So make a note to myself. And yeah, it's a really fascinating view. And so hopefully this answers your question. Yes, absolutely, you can. And actually in the Judaic tradition, there is no conception of hell. The closest they get is a view of purgatory, right? Or a temporary state where you await judgment. But again, it's temporary and not hell. Just not a state of paradise. But Jews don't really have heaven either, because the idea is that it's supposed to be created here on earth. So the Jewish view of the afterlife is very different from the other Abrahamic traditions. But yes, you can absolutely, again, there's so much variety, I think, is what is important to take away. Right? And as much as these religious traditions that we're looking at have a lot of things in common, also you could be a member of any one of them and have vastly different views, right, from members of that one tradition. And that's because historically, over time, there would be certain things that would create tension within a religion, and that would usually cause it to fracture and break off, right? And so those continue to kind of split over time, right? So most people are familiar with like famous examples from Christianity, right? The split, the Great Schism between the Catholic and Protestants, right, was a theological dispute over the role of the church, right, and who has the authority to be a messenger of God, right? So you see similar sorts of issues in Buddhism, Hinduism, right, Eastern religions as well, as in the other Abrahamic religions. So, and because they've all been around for so long, they've had so many different splits. And then when you add that to colonialization and global travel, right, then you get variations of these different traditions as they move across the world, right? So Buddhism, came from which tradition? Did anyone, you might not have gotten there yet. It's a little early, but does anyone know which religion Buddhism came from? But it came from India. So what was the dominant, religion there at the time? Excuse me, does anyone know? Hinduism, very good, right? So Buddhism is one of like 8 different schools of Hinduism, right? So Hinduism was in existence for so long, even before Buddhism emerged, right? It split off into all these different schools. Buddhism was one of them, right? And then Buddhism itself has been around for so long. So it's broken off into many different schools. And the Buddhism that originated in India looks very different from the Buddhism as it moves into China and Japan and then even as we see it move over into the West, right? And so there, again, so much variety that is explained not just by the historical influence of religions that came before them, but also by just geographical movement, right? And being influenced by the culture that you sort of move into. Good, excellent questions. All right. Okay, Mason, what is the purpose of tragedies? Why would an all good God have need to let these things happen? Good, right? So again, continuing on this theme of potential worries, right? Or critiques or responses to the conception of God that was being argued for last week, right? Is this idea specifically that three of those attributes come into particular logical conflict with one another and create this unique problem called the problem of evil. Right. And again, and I have an infographic about this, right, on my philosophy of religion gig page. But the idea here is that the three omnis that are important here are omnibenevolence, right, omniscience, or being all knowing, and all powerful, or being omnipotent. Okay. Now, why these three in particular? Okay. Well, if God is all powerful, then God could stop anything they wanted to, right? So with the power comes the capacity to intervene should they have the will to do so, okay? Knowledge, omniscience. God knows everything, even before it happens, right? Very common conception or attribute of God. Well, if God knows everything before it happens, well, then God, if they wanted to intervene, would know when and where to do so. Right? So it's not from lack of information, right? That God is not intervening in some cases.